Every system has a cycle, one where it's backed with new licensed games and continued distribution of hardware, the other when support is dropped, leaving only a trickle of releases, typically consisting of games that were already near the end of their development cycle. The release of the last licensed title rarely corresponds date-wise to when support is officially or unofficially dropped for a system. This is due in part to the sometimes slow liquidation of remaining hardware stock. At some point, these rivers run dry and there is nothing left for consumers to look forward to. For a small segment of people, they are unwilling to let these systems fade into the darkness. What is it about these consoles that continues to captivate the hearts and minds of people decades after the last game ships? A captivation that drives a small segment of creators to actively support these abandoned systems with new software and physical releases long after it's deemed profitable to do so. We are going to look at a handful of developers who are still creating software for these systems. This is Retro Impressions, Why We Create. In order to properly cover the home console, we need to start at the beginning, and that means looking at the Magnavox Odyssey. It's a system that would have been forgotten even amongst the most dedicated gaming enthusiasts, save for the fact that it was the first home game console ever released. But it's notable for more than that. Although it's often lumped in with the first generation of consoles, it's not uncommon for those who know it best to consider a generation unto its own.
It's kind of like Odyssey came out, and then in 1975, the first generation happened when Home Pong was released. Game console generation is like this homogeneous thing where you could have a similar game on two platforms, like Super Nintendo and Genesis, right? You know, Super Nintendo's got more colors, Genesis is faster, but you can still have Mortal Kombat 2 on both consoles, and it's the same basic game, it just looks a little different. You couldn't even run Pong on an Odyssey because, you know, Pong has, first it has walls, right? It's got a computer, it keeps score, and it has, the computer itself has rules. So it's just like two totally different kind of worlds. So Odyssey is really neat to me because it's so unique in what it is, and there's nothing that's else out there that's like it that wasn't a clone of it. There's a few Odyssey clones, but there's no other independently developed video game console out there that's anything like Odyssey. After Home Pong, the whole rest of the first generation becomes, you know, Pong Clone Wars, right?
Over the life of the Odyssey, 28 games were released that required one of 12 printed circuit boards called game cards, along with a screen overlay to function. These game cards were nothing more than daughter boards that utilized jumper connections, causing the motherboard and the console to behave differently. It wasn't uncommon for games to utilize the same game card, such as hockey and tennis requiring number 3, or soccer and handball with number 8. By the time the final game shipped in 1973, all but game card 11 had released. It was intended to be sold with the game basketball, but due to cost-saving reasons, the plan was scrapped with the decision to use the already available number 8. Nearly 35 years passed, and by 2009, Rob from Retro Game Livingroom had become fascinated by the prospect of making a new game for the system utilizing the never-before-released game card 11. Thankfully, David Winter had preserved the schematics for all 12 cards on his webpage, pongstory.com. Like most of these passion projects, the resulting game named Oddball had less than a handful of copies made. The opportunity to acquire it came and went in a blink of an eye, a boon to everyone who loved the console and was in the right place at the right time to take advantage of the limited opportunity for a new experience on an abandoned console. Of course, not all homebrews that receive a physical release sell print runs so small that they can only be counted on two hands, and not all releases for abandoned systems can be considered homebrews. Traditionally speaking, a homebrew was a game made by someone in a non-professional setting for an abandoned piece of hardware. These games are often made without profit in mind or with the intention to only recoup the cost involved. Unlicensed games were typically produced during the life of a console, often bypassing lockout chips in order to self-publish games without the need of paying royalties, getting approval, or meeting the standards set in place for that particular system. Tengen on the NES and Alkalate on the Genesis are prime examples of companies that utilize professional teams to produce unlicensed games as part of their business model. Let's not forget Rom Hacks. These are existing games that have been reworked in some form or fashion. So where does that leave these new companies that are now producing software at a professional level for these abandoned consoles?
I don't know like what your thoughts with the term homebrew is, but I'm not a huge fan of that word, to be honest. I say it because most people, I think, are familiar with that term. They know what it is. But it's almost like, I like to think of what we do and other people do as almost like indie developers for classic consoles, right? because it really is like we're making a new game for a client. We're not making it out of our house. It's like full production. We do the manual, the cart, the game, the box, all that, So like when you get a game from CollectorVision Games, we want it to be the same quality that you'd get if it was like back in the 90s or 80s or whenever the system came out.
I personally call it aftermarket games because the market's gone. Like if they were doing it for, Xbox One, yeah, I'd call it an unlicensed game.
Unlicensed games were traditionally published when the company backing the console was actively marketing it. Years later, professional teams are stepping to the plate, basing their business plans around releasing games for these systems long after the market and support has dried up. One of the first companies to produce aftermarket games with some success was CollectorVision. Founded in 2008 with a heavy focus on second-generation consoles, they have enjoyed enough success to continue releasing games a decade later. A lot of their success has come from supporting systems that receive little to no attention, yet continue to have dedicated fan bases with a particular emphasis on the ColecoVision.
Surprisingly enough, our least selling console right now is the NES, which is surprising to me, because you think that'd be the most people would be most fond of, and kind of. But I think there's so many new games for the NES. I think we can kind of get lost in the shadows, right?
Recently, John and his team have turned their attention to less supported 4th-generation consoles, including the Super Nintendo and Sega CD. When CollectorVision started development for their new Sydney Hunter game on the Super Nintendo, the system was a desert with little to no development or community support.
The Super Nintendo, we've come to find out, there's not many Super Nintendo new games for that particular console for a reason. That's because it's such a really difficult system to program for from scratch. When you do see a new Super Nintendo game, a lot of time it's like a reskin or maybe like an incomplete game, but going from a completely new game from scratch, it's very difficult to program for Super Nintendo, unfortunately. But we got through it. It took over 3 years to produce this game. And there were parts in the game, for example, there's a rope mechanic where Sidney has to climb up this rope on a vertical kind of a 45-degree angle. And then when he slides down, he uses his boomerang and he slides down. It seems simple enough, but it was a very difficult thing to work out, to program to make it look smooth and whatnot. And he was finally able to get it to work. But I know there were some stages there where like, wow, this is, what do we get ourselves into?
Fortunately for John and his team, the idea of creating a new game for the Super Nintendo was well enough received that CollectorVision has started work on another release for the system called Justice Beaver. In addition to these 2 new Super Nintendo games, they are also porting Sydney Hunter to the Sega CD, a release that will finally give fans of that system their first new game in over a quarter century. With the recent revival of interest in these old systems, including new clone and emulation consoles being sold to the mass market, it's not exactly surprising to see strong demand for new content. Even while the majority of the work is still being done by a handful of people, it's not uncommon to see teams of similar size and development times to when these systems were still being supported. Making games today for these old systems isn't exactly straightforward. Developer tools were often made in-house and rarely, if ever, released to the public. Most companies also had access to development hardware that was supplied by the system manufacturer, allowing for quick testing of each program build. While most of these tools and the hardware have been lost to time, it hasn't stopped teams of programmers from trying their hand at creating something new on these platforms.
My name is Mike Tucker, and I'm one of the directors at Bitmap Bureau. My main role is game design and gameplay programming. I work with Matt Cope, who is our technical director and business guy. For the large part, he does all of the awkward jobs, so all of the technical coding.
Together, Mike and Matt run Bitmap Bureau, developer of the highly anticipated new Sega Mega Drive game, Zeno Crisis. It's an arena shooter that takes inspiration from Shock Troopers and Smash TV. It's not their first game as a company or even their first game together. They met while working at IOMO, a mobile platform development studio who released games containing top-tier licenses such as Tiger Woods Golf and Tomb Raider. Like most people who create games for abandoned systems, Mike's story starts in his adolescent years.
I guess I had a fascination from the age of about 6 when I used to go to various places with my parents. Like in England, you could go to a fish and chip shop or a cafe, and quite often they'd have an arcade machine in the corner. So the games I used to come across back then were like Xevious, Gradius, Sinstar, Tempest, Gauntlet. So the old Atari, Konami, Namco stuff. And yeah, just the amazing cabinets and the sounds they produced and the amazing imagery and the gameplay and game design, it really grasped me from a young age.
Mike desired to bring the arcade experience home, and in the late 80s, a company called Sega released a system in Japan that promised to do precisely that. For Mike, the decision was easy. He got a job delivering newspapers, eventually saving up enough money to send off for one via mail order.
A couple of years later, when I was 13, that I imported my first Mega Drive from Japan. And yeah, of course, going from a 4-color CGA PC to a Sega Mega Drive was just such a huge jump. And we were able to play almost perfect arcade conversions in your home. So yeah, it was great, and I still have a lot of love for that machine, and yeah, I still have my Mega Drive.
As Mike became an adult, his love for games drove him to pursue a career in the industry, and after finishing college, he received his first break.
But yeah, I saw an advertisement from a recruitment agency in the back of Edge magazine, and this company, I think I just wrote off to them, and within a few days, they asked me if I wanted a job interview in Southampton with what was then Sales Curve Interactive. So they were producing games like the Lawnmower Man, which is quite infamously bad, of course, but one of the first CD-ROM games. And later on, they were making Carmageddon and so on. So yeah, this was my opportunity to get into the games industry. And yeah, I really couldn't believe that I had this interview. And I went along to the interview with my PlayStation memory card, which had all my Ridge Racer lap times on it. And I think just showing them that card was enough to get me the job. And that was my entrance into the industry.
From there, he would go on to work at IOMO. Before they could release their first game, Sega put an end to the Dreamcast, and IOMO shifted gears, becoming one of the first companies to create games for monochrome mobile phones. Working in this budding industry required programmers to work within the constraints of extremely limited hardware with unusually limited resources, a limitation that would help Mike develop the skills needed to work within the constraints of the Mega Drive's vastly outdated architecture. Fast forward to 2016, and Bitmap Bureau took part in a game jam where they put together a game for the Mega Drive in 48 hours. It was a simple shooter, but with that one creation, there was a new realization.
It proved to us that we could make a Mega Drive game, and we thought that if we put a decent amount of time into it, we could create something special. So yeah, that's how Zeno Crisis came about, really.
Nowadays, people making games for the Genesis are fortunate to have access to the SGDK, something used by nearly every developer who creates games for the system. As this piece of software has become the cornerstone for most Genesis development, it's worth looking deeper into what exactly it does and a bit of the history behind it. Stefan was raised in France and grew up much like any other gaming enthusiast. He had access to arcade games, and his family purchased an Amstrad GX400 while he was still a young boy. From there, his family added an NES and Mega Drive, then later a Master System and Super Nintendo. By the age of 14, Stefan received a calculator that allowed for some basic programming, giving him his first outlet to create something original. Near the end of the 90s, he had become fascinated by the then revolutionary Nesticle. This program allowed PC emulation of regular Nintendo games, something people had only dreamed of up to that point. While emulating NES games was something worth bragging about, Stefan was a dedicated Sega fanboy and wondered if he could achieve similar results for the Genesis. His end product was called Gens, and it quickly picked up popularity, giving Stefan the drive and encouragement to add additional support for the 32X and Mega CD, making it the first emulator of its kind. Creating stable emulation requires the developer to become intimate with the hardware, something that allowed Stefan to easily shift his focus to a new project dubbed the Sega Genesis Development Kit, or SGDK. Without a doubt, Stefan's SGDK has been instrumental in the uptick of high-end games being developed for the system. Games such as Zeno Crisis, Crypt of Dracula, Cave Story MD, Coffee Crisis, and the newly announced Tänzer have utilized it, cutting months off their total development time. Time saved that might otherwise kill a project. There's also the issue of finding a working development kit. In some cases, such as the Mega Drive, only a handful are known to exist, making it a near impossible option for most people. By using these custom development kits on modern computers, developers are able to jump right into the meat of creating their project without having to become intimate with the details of how the hardware works. Of course, there's a small segment of individuals who are dedicated to the old ways, opting to build their own tools. For the most part, the demo community has no real interest in using kits such as the SGDK. Advanced demos such as Overdrive are instead written in assembly, as the SGDK is more or less designed to help utilize the most basic functions of the hardware, whereas the deep, stunning visuals being pulled off in Overdrive are the result of precisely timed deep tricks, utilizing assembly code to push the hardware to its absolute max.
The SGDK is giving people the opportunity to do things a lot easier, because you can just use a flash cart and obviously compile your ROM to the flash cart and then test it on the hardware you want to use. So it's simplifying the whole way we go about developing games for these sort of systems. Because the SGDK is a higher level language, it's a lot easier to learn. So I have a lot of respect for the people who do use the old school kit, and it means they can get a lot more out of the hardware. But for the vast majority of people, I imagine the SGDK is opening up a lot of opportunities for people to just sit down and have a go without really needing to sort of learn the complexities of the hardware, which is it's not a bad thing.
Fortunately, for those wanting to test the waters outside of the Mega Drive, people's passion for specific platforms has resulted in dedicated development kits popping up for systems that seemed unapproachable just last year. Even Sega Saturn, which is typically considered the most complex piece of hardware to develop for, has finally started to receive support. The pull of these projects has started to bring veteran support to the table. Masters of the hardware who worked with these systems while they were still being supported are returning to the platforms that gave the community their most notable work. Pixel artists such as Hank Nyborg, who was behind projects such as The Adventures of Lomax, Contra 4, Shantae, and the Mega Drive Mega CD game, Flink, has taken up the task of creating some of the finest pixel art the Genesis has ever experienced in Zeno Crisis. When it comes to finding people who are qualified to work on these projects, it's not always industry veterans who are being sourced.
The Mega Drive's got such a distinct sound chip that to get the best out of it, you have to have some real talent. And I've been listening to a guy called Savage Regime on YouTube for some time, and he was doing some incredible stuff with the YM2612. And yeah, again, we approached him, and he was very interested to work on the project. And he very quickly made the trailer music for us, actually, for the Kickstarter campaign. So that was very fortunate. And the other music he's produced is absolutely stunning, really. I think it's the best I've heard coming out of the Mega Drive. I can say that without being biased. So yeah, there's more great stuff to come.
There are a lot of fascinating projects that have recently released or are on the horizon, but one taking the road less traveled is Tanglewood by Matt Phillips.
Back in the days where computers came with instruction manuals on how to program, which is a bit of a lost art recently, I think. So yeah, the Commodore 64 came with this manual that showed you how to set it up, and then straight into programming tutorials. So it had small demos like getting a sprite on screen. I remember it was a little hot air balloon with the Commodore 64 logo in the middle. That took hours to type out from the listing in the manual. It didn't come with a tape or a disc, it just came with it printed. But you had to write all the code for describing the sprite, each pixel row at a time, and then the code to get it on screen and move it around. I think I only ever saw that once because I didn't know how to back up my stuff on tape back then.
After completing university, Matt got a job with Traveler's Tales, a development studio responsible for some of the more technically accomplished Genesis releases and the popular LEGO Games series. In total, Matt would work on 13 AAA titles in addition to creating the visual effects system used for the LEGO Batman movie. Traveler's Tales was founded in 1989 by John Burton, and as a continuously running studio decades later, a number of veteran Mega Drive developers were still with the company, including Dave Dootson.
I had a few conversations with him about techniques and how to get into it, how to get started. And there were some other veteran Mega Drive programmers still there, back from the Sonic 3D days. And they all got the ideas into my head to actually pursue this dream and go for it.
Around 2012, Matt acquired a non-functioning Cross Productions Mega CD development kit. As with most Mega Drive development kits, these units are incredibly rare, with at most 2 to 3 coming to market each decade. Over the next 2 years, he would source parts from across the world to repair the unit, relying on sites such as Assembler Games and eBay. The goal being to recreate the total experience of creating a game in the early 90s, then create a game using that system.
Yeah, we're using a Cross Products Mega CD development kit, which is made around 92, and that's running on an old MS-DOS computer with giant ISO cards plugged in. I write all my own tools on the top, so my own level editor, I've got my own audio tools, my own sprite and animation system. That's all written by myself, kind of as an authentic thing. People would have written their own tools back in the day, back in the 90s. I kind of wanted to emulate that experience. Tanglewood's written pure assembly language using an assembler from the early 90s. It's all done from the ground up. There was no code there when I started. It was an empty notepad. And I've written every line myself from the ground up.
It's not to say Matt doesn't have assistance in other areas. A lot of the music and art have been sourced to other individuals such as Matt Weeks, who prior to this project had worked on the game Freedom Planet. The resulting game from all of this is Tanglewood. It's a story-driven puzzle platform adventure game that promises to offer up a genre not often seen or supported on older hardware. A game that aims to appeal to those who are fans of newer titles such as Inside and classics such as the Oddworld series. Having spent months speaking to numerous people about their games, one thing has become clear. Every single person behind one of these projects is at the upper end of the passion spectrum when it comes to these abandoned systems. They care deeply about preserving the experience of the original hardware and aim to do that by creating a new sense of wonder in hopes of maintaining these systems' relevance in a modern conversation.
Yeah, so I think like everybody else that has ever done this or will do this, we're heavily influenced by it as children. You know, I like to think that if 8-year-old James met 30-year-old Andy, we'd high-five each other and be excited. I don't think anyone that does gaming, retro or otherwise, feels too different from that. You know, it's like a personally fulfilling just as much as anything else. I grew up with the Genesis. It's still, where I live and breathe for sure. But I'm pretty excited about the whole scene right now. Zeno Crisis and Tanglewood, I was, like day one backers for them. It's great. I can't wait to see them come out, and hopefully, we get to see Project Y come out too. I wish I could walk into, Best Buy and pick up, a hot Genesis release still. So that's serving that same need and then some. Because from the looks of it, those games are going to surpass tons of commercial releases during the actual life cycle of the Genesis.
Ultimately, the high quality of developers finding their way to the classics, along with a renewed interest in retro consoles, has ushered in a new age of game development, one that's yet to be fully realized. Why We Create set out as a quest to discover precisely why individuals continue to pour time and money into projects that more often than not will never reach a wide audience. In the end, what I found is that these are the individuals that most closely mirror my feelings, passions, and desires from when I was a kid. A love that inspires me to create videos about games that in some cases will only be viewed by a handful of people.
I never quite understood my peers as a kid. They all wanted to do things like be bank managers and sort of boring jobs. I never got it. These kids were really into video games and films and TV and stuff, and I never got why they didn't want to be actors or games developers or something really cool like that. I guess I was the odd child in a way. I wanted to make a job of the things I enjoyed doing as a kid. So if there was a degree in climbing trees, I'd have gone and done that.
As an adult looking back to my childhood and forward to my children's future, Matt Phillips' sentiment about choices made that define our careers and hobbies is something I believe to be increasingly relevant. Something we can have a direct impact on by pursuing our own dreams or doing our best to lift up and encourage those around us. I've left links in the description detailing a number of upcoming and available projects from people who contributed to the making of this documentary. If you're able, I highly encourage you to check out the ones that interest you, and support the small and wonderful community of individuals. I'm Jenovi, and this is Retro Impressions. Feel free to leave a positive or negative comment letting me know your thoughts, and as always, thanks for watching.